The words her husband spoke in Mandarin were quiet, almost casual. The way you'd comment on the weather or order another drink. But Cleo heard every syllable, and her champagne glass went still in her hand. They were standing in the lobby of the Fairmont Chateau Whistler, 300 guests swirling around them in evening wear and expensive perfume. The annual gala for Whitmore Capital had drawn the usual crowd. Fund managers, real estate developers, people whose net worth had too many digits to say aloud. Cleo had spent 6 weeks organizing the seating charts, the floral arrangements, the silent auction. She knew every detail of that room. What she hadn't expected was to understand the conversation her husband was having in the corner with his business partner. Wei, she's decorative, Danton said in Mandarin, nodding slightly in her direction. Good for events like this, clients like that. I have a stable home. But she's not exactly sharp, if you know what I mean. Wei smiled into his glass. The other one understands the business, Danton continued. Vivienne actually reads the quarterly reports. She asks the right questions. Cleo did not move. She kept her expression exactly where it was. Pleasantly interested, slightly distracted, the practiced look of a woman who was accustomed to standing near important conversations she wasn't part of. She had worn that expression so many times in the past 4 years that it had become almost involuntary. What Danton didn't know, what he had never thought to ask, was that Cleo had spent 3 years living in Chengdu before they met. She'd been 23, fresh out of a linguistics degree from UBC, teaching English and absorbing the language around her with the same quiet intensity she'd applied to everything in her life. By the time she left, she read Mandarin well enough to argue over restaurant bills and understand boardroom negotiations. She spoke it with an accent that made native speakers pause and then nod with respect. Danton had proposed 18 months after they met at a charity dinner in Vancouver. He'd asked her what she did, and she'd said she was between things, which was true. She'd just come back from abroad and was figuring out next steps. He'd found that charming. He'd never revisited the question. She set her champagne on the tray of a passing server and smiled at no one in particular. She had heard every word. The drive back to their house in West Vancouver was quiet. Danton talked about the gala the way he always talked about events she'd organized. Briefly, generically, as if it had simply materialized on its own. Great turnout, good energy in the room. The Chens seemed pleased. Cleo looked at the lights along the bridge and said yes, I think it went well. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her side of the bed listening to Danton breathe and did the arithmetic of the past 4 years. The dinners she'd hosted. The clients she'd charmed on his behalf. Intuiting exactly which conversation to have with which person. Reading the room the way she'd been trained by years of cultural immersion. And a childhood spent watching her mother navigate rooms where she wasn't entirely welcome. The way she'd quietly let her own ambitions narrow and compress until they fit inside the shape of his life. Vivienne. She turned the name over like a stone. Vivienne Lacours was Danton's director of acquisitions. Cleo had met her several times at firm events. A composed woman in her late 30s, always in muted colors, always with the precise and calibrated warmth of someone who knew exactly what impression she was making. Cleo had always vaguely respected her. Now that feeling curdled into something else. She thought about the prenuptial agreement. Danton had presented it 2 weeks before their wedding, apologetically, explaining that his family's lawyers required it for anyone with his level of assets. Cleo had signed it. She'd been 29, in love, and had trusted that the future would be long and uncomplicated. The agreement was clear. In the event of divorce, she would receive a lump sum of $75,000, and no claim to his business holdings or investment portfolio. $75,000. After 4 years. But her father had been a family law paralegal for 30 years before his retirement, and he had read every page before she signed. He'd sat at his kitchen table in Burnaby with a yellow highlighter and his reading glasses, and when he finished he'd looked up and said, "There's one thing here you should know about," and then he'd explained the infidelity clause. If Danton was unfaithful, the prenup was void. Full stop. She had never thought she'd need it. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the island in the dark, looking at nothing, letting the shock burn down to something cooler and more useful. By the time the kettle had gone cold she had made a decision. She was not going to react. Not yet. The next morning she texted her oldest friend, a woman named Odette, who had been her roommate at UBC, and who now practiced family law in downtown Vancouver. They met for lunch 2 days later at a Vietnamese place on Robson that they'd been going to for 12 years. Cleo told her everything. About the gala, Vivienne. The prenup. Odette listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Cleo finished, Odette set down her chopsticks. "You understand what you have," Odette said. "I think so. The infidelity clause is your leverage. But we need proof, not just what you heard, documentation of the affair. She paused. Do you have access to his devices? His laptop password is our anniversary. He's never changed it. Odette looked at her steadily. Cleo, you have to decide if you want to do this the fast way or the right way. What's the difference? The fast way is you confront him now, he denies everything, and you fight over whether you heard what you heard. The right way is you build a case first. Ironclad. Then you walk in with everything and he has nothing to argue with. How long does the right way take? Odette picked up her chopsticks again. Depends on what you find. But I'd say give it 6 to 8 weeks. Can you hold it together that long? Cleo thought about standing in that lobby, champagne in hand, expression perfectly arranged, while her husband explained her limitations to his business partner in a language he assumed she didn't speak. Yes, she said. I can hold it together. She started that same week. Danton kept his laptop in his study, which shared a wall with the room Cleo used as an office. He worked late most evenings and slept heavily. On the third night, after she heard him go upstairs, she sat at his desk and opened the laptop. The emails were not hard to find. He hadn't even tried to hide them, or rather he'd never imagined he needed to. There were dozens of them, going back 19 months. Some were businesslike, some were not. She photographed everything systematically, working her way through the threads, her face neutral, her hands steady. She created a new email address on her phone and sent herself everything. She also found his calendar. Events marked with only initials, VL. During times he'd told her he was working late or traveling for due diligence. Hotel reservations in his name for dates that matched those entries exactly. A recurring charge on his business card for a restaurant in Yaletown that she'd never been taken to. She cross-referenced everything, created a document in a cloud account he didn't know existed, and backed it all up in 3 places. 2 cheeks in, she found something she hadn't been looking for. Danton's firm was in the process of preparing a prospectus for a major private equity raise. A fund targeting commercial real estate across Western Canada. She'd heard him mention it in passing, the kind of passing mention that was designed to communicate importance without inviting questions. What she found in his sent folder, buried in a thread with the firm's CFO, suggested that certain assets listed in the prospectus were being valued at projections that didn't match the underlying appraisals she could see attached to earlier emails in the same chain. The upper nexus to music She didn't fully understand what she was looking at. But she understood enough to know it was worth understanding more. She photographed everything and sent it to Odette with a note. I found something. Can you look at this with fresh eyes? Odette called within an hour. Where did you get this? His laptop. This isn't just a divorce matter, Cleo. I know. If these valuations are being misrepresented to investors, we're potentially looking at securities fraud. That's a different scale of problem. Is it useful to us? It's leverage, Odette said carefully. We're not going to threaten him with it. But when we file and he decides to fight the settlement, he'll have to calculate whether dragging this into discovery is something he wants to risk. Cleo sat with that for a moment. Okay. Are you all right? I'm fine. She paused. I've been fine for weeks. That's the strangest part. She had been fine. Not numb, fine. Focused in a way she hadn't been in years. She woke up early every morning and went to the small desk in her office and worked on plans she'd let go dormant. A consulting practice she'd sketched out twice and then set aside when Danton's schedule required her attention elsewhere. She had the training. She had the languages. She had the cultural knowledge that took most consultants a decade of expensive mistakes to develop. She just needed the capital and the time, and in a few weeks she would have both. She also paid more attention to Viviane Lecourse. Not obsessively, strategically. She looked at the quarterly reports Danton filed with the firm and noticed Viviane's name on 3 acquisitions that had underperformed significantly. She looked at Viviane's compensation structure in a document she found in Danton's files, and saw that she was being paid at a rate that would have been notable even for a stronger track record. She couldn't tell yet whether that was favoritism or something more deliberate. She kept watching. On the 4th week, she accepted an invitation she would normally have declined. A reception hosted by the British Columbia Association of Cross-Cultural Business Consultants at a hotel in Gastown. She'd been a member for 2 years and attended almost nothing. She went and she stayed, and she talked to people for 3 hours with the full force of her attention. She came home with 14 business cards and 2 genuine offers of collaboration. One of them was from a woman named Dr. Sylvie Fontaine, a professor at SFU's business school, who was leading a project on intercultural negotiation practices in Pacific Rim trade. She needed consultants with lived experience in East Asian markets. The pay was modest but the networks were not, and Sylvie had mentioned the possibility of a more substantial contract with a federal trade bureau that was looking for private sector expertise. Cleo emailed her the next morning. Danton noticed nothing. He was absorbed in the fundraising process, home late, distracted at dinner, occasionally warm in the vague way of someone who was making an effort without knowing quite why. He asked her once, across the kitchen island, whether she had any plans for the fall. She said she was thinking about getting more involved in her professional network. He said that sounds great, and then his phone buzzed and his attention went elsewhere. She cleared the dishes and thought about what she'd found on his laptop the week before. A message from Viviane attached to a photo of a hotel room in Montreal that began with the words "finally, just the two of us." She had 19 months of documentation. She was ready. The timing chose itself. Danton's firm was hosting a client dinner at a private room at a Japanese restaurant in Kitsilano. He asked Cleo to come, a table of 8, including 2 representatives from a Tokyo-based fund, considering a significant investment in his real estate portfolio. He mentioned offhand that the guests spoke limited English. She smiled and said she'd be happy to be there. She wore a charcoal silk dress and kept her hair simple. She sat across from the 2 Japanese guests, a senior partner named Adachi and a quieter colleague named Kyo, and let the first 10 minutes unfold the way Danton expected. Small talk in English, polite nodding, the kind of pleasant, undemanding presence she had perfected. Then Adachi said something to Kiyoshi in Japanese, a comment about the business projections, skeptical in tone, asking whether the Canadian market conditions actually supported what they'd been presented. Cleo set down her fork and responded in Japanese, calmly, precisely, and with the specific vocabulary of someone who understood what they were asking. The table went silent. Adachi stared at her. Then he said, in Japanese, "You speak Japanese. I studied in Chengdu and spent time in Osaka in my mid-20s. Cleo said, still in Japanese, "I find it easier to have certain conversations in the language everyone is actually thinking in." Adachi looked at her for a long moment and then, for the first time that evening, he laughed, genuinely. Danton's face had gone the color of old plaster. He recovered in a few seconds, smiled, said something smooth in English about surprises, but his eyes were fixed on her with an expression she'd never seen before. She smiled back pleasantly and turned her attention to Adachi. The dinner continued. Cleo translated naturally, bridged gaps in the conversation, and at one point gently corrected a projection that Danton had overstated. In English, carefully framed as clarification, but precise enough that Adachi noted it. She collected both guests' business cards at the end of the evening, and they handed them over with the particular formality that indicated genuine regard. In the car on the way home, Danton said nothing for 3 blocks. Then, "Since when do you speak Japanese?" "I've been conversational for about 5 years. "You never asked." "I didn't know you." "How did I not know that?" "You knew I lived in East Asia for several years. The language would be a natural consequence." She looked out the window. "You've just never asked me much about that time." Another silence. "You corrected me in front of clients." "I clarified a figure." Adachi appreciated the accuracy. "That's not the point." His voice had shifted into something harder. "I think accuracy with investors is exactly the point," she said quietly. He didn't respond. When they got home he went to his study and she went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in her silk dress, and thought about how many times she'd had a version of this conversation in her head over the past 6 weeks, and how much calmer she felt than she'd imagined. She texted Odette, "Tomorrow." Odette replied in 30 seconds, "I'll be ready." In the morning, while Danton was in the shower, Cleo collected the documents she'd assembled from the secondary email account and printed them at the shop on Marine Drive on her way to meet Odette. She sat in the familiar chair across from Odette's desk at 9:15, and Odette's assistant filed the divorce petition at 10. She was back on Marine Drive buying a coffee when Danton called. She let it go to voicemail. He called 4 more times in the next hour. His lawyer called Odette's office before noon. By mid-afternoon, Odette said his team had already signaled they intended to contest the prenup's applicability. "Meaning what?" Cleo asked. "Meaning they're going to argue that even with the infidelity clause, your claim to assets is limited and that the documentation you have was obtained improperly." "Was it?" "Legally gray. You had access to the shared home and the devices therein. We have strong footing." Odette paused. "But he's also going to fight the business valuation claim. The claim based on my initial investment." 4 years ago, early in the marriage, Cleo had transferred $120,000 into one of Danton's early fund vehicles. It had been her inheritance from her grandmother. Money held in trust since she was 22. Danton had called it a vote of confidence. The fund formation documents, which she'd photographed carefully, listed her as a founding investor. That money had since grown inside a portfolio now valued at over $60 million. Odette's forensic accountant had calculated her proportional claim at slightly over $4 million, independent of the prenup. He's going to say the prenup covers that, Odette said. Does it? The prenup was signed 3 months after your investment was made. Your investment predates the agreement entirely. His lawyers know that's a problem. She folded her hands on the desk. Which brings me to the other thing. The prospectus discrepancies. Odette's contact at a securities law firm had reviewed what Cleo found and confirmed that the valuation methodology was aggressive enough to warrant scrutiny. Not necessarily criminal, but the kind of thing that became very uncomfortable under deposition conditions. We're not going to threaten him with it, Odette said, but I've advised his counsel that our discovery requests will be broad and that we intend to examine all documents related to the fundraising process. And they've asked for a settlement meeting. Danton came to the meeting 10 days later looking like a man who hadn't been sleeping. He had 2 lawyers with him. Cleo sat across the table with Odette and said almost nothing. She let the lawyers talk in their careful, circling language, and she kept her hands folded and her expression neutral. And she thought about a Tuesday morning in Chengdu 15 years ago, when she'd gotten her first full sentence out in Mandarin, and the woman at the dumpling stall had looked at her with genuine surprise and then smiled like they shared a secret. The settlement took 2.5 hours to reach. She walked out with the $4 million from her investment, acknowledged without dispute. She walked out with the infidelity clause enacted, and the prenup void, entitling her to a share of marital assets that amounted to another $2.25 million. She walked out with no claim on his firm's future earnings, which was fine, because she'd seen the fundraising documents, and she wasn't sure his firm had much of a future. She walked out and stood on the sidewalk in the November air and felt very little except a quiet, steady sense of having done something difficult with precision. Odette came out behind her and said, "You okay?" "Yes." Cleo exhaled slowly. "I'm genuinely okay." She'd booked a room at a boutique hotel near the seawall weeks in advance, just in case. She checked in that afternoon and unpacked the bag she'd kept in Odette's storage locker. She ordered room service and opened her laptop and replied to Dr. Sylvie Fontaine's email, accepting the consulting contract she'd been holding off on. Then she called her mother, who listened carefully and then said, in Cantonese, "Your grandmother would have been very pleased." The weeks after that were logistical and, in their way, peaceful. She found an apartment in Mount Pleasant with good light and a small balcony. She bought furniture in the colors she liked rather than the colors that photographed well for Danton's listing updates. She got a library card. She started cooking again. Really cooking, experimenting, making food that was complicated and sometimes imperfect. She also started working. Sylvie's project was genuinely interesting. Rigorous in the way academic work was rigorous, collaborative in a way that corporate environments usually weren't. Cleo found herself in meetings where people listened when she spoke and then built on what she said, rather than waiting for her to stop talking. She contributed a framework for analyzing communication breakdowns in multilateral negotiations that Sylvie described as the most practically grounded thinking I've encountered on this in years. The federal contract came through in January. It was a 6-month engagement that paid more than Cleo had earned in any single year before her marriage. She took on 2 smaller corporate clients alongside it and began sketching, seriously this time, the architecture of an independent consulting practice. Meanwhile, she heard things about Danton. The way you hear things in a city the size of Vancouver. Secondhand, through mutual contacts, in the careful way people tell you news they're not sure you want. The fundraising process had stalled. Several investors had withdrawn during due diligence. There were rumors that the BC Securities Commission had made inquiries. Viviane Lacours had resigned in December and was not, as far as anyone knew, working in finance anymore. Cleo heard these things and felt a sort of distant acknowledgement, the way you might register the weather in a city you'd lived in once and moved on from. She didn't take pleasure in it exactly. She just noted it and went back to work. In February, she gave a presentation at a business school panel on cross-cultural negotiation in Pacific Rim markets. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, moving between English, Mandarin, and enough Japanese that the moderator afterwards said it had been the most engaging session of the year. 3 people in the audience asked for her contact information. One of them was a senior director at a federal trade ministry office in Ottawa who said, "I think we've been looking for someone exactly like you." She drove home along the seawall and parked and sat for a moment before going in. The water was dark and the mountains were just shapes against the sky. She thought about the gala at the Fairmont, the glass going still in her hand, the specific quality of the air in that lobby when she understood what she was hearing. She thought about how she'd stood there perfectly composed and let Danton speak about her like she was furniture, and then walked to the car and driven home and gone to bed and not slept, and in the morning she'd started. In March, Cleo incorporated her consulting practice. She named it Meridian Cross, which was a little formal and a little geographic, and meant something specific to her that she didn't explain to anyone. She filed the paperwork on a Thursday morning in a coffee shop on Commercial Drive, had a flat white, and then went to her first meeting of the day. She had 3 clients by the end of the month. By June she had 7, including a partnership with Sylvie's University that provided a steady stream of referrals. She hired a part-time project coordinator, a young woman named. She chose the name herself for the first time in years, chose her own staff, her own hours, her own terms. She was at a conference in Ottawa in June, presenting on a panel about navigating East Asian business culture for Canadian exporters, when she ran into Adachi. He was attending the same event as part of a delegation. He recognized her immediately and crossed the room. "Messrs. Fontaine mentioned your firm," he said in Japanese. He looked pleased. "We thought you might be the same person from that dinner." "The same person," she confirmed. "Your husband, he is no longer in the picture, correct?" Adachi nodded slowly. "We withdrew from his fund. There were concerns about the documentation." He paused. "We would be interested in discussing whether your consultancy could assist us with our Canadian market entry. We need someone who understands both the regulatory environment and the cultural dynamics." She said she'd send a proposal. He said he looked forward to it. She walked back to her hotel that evening along the Rideau Canal with the sun going sideways and the water catching it. She called Odette. "I think I just got the biggest client I've ever had," she said. "How big?" "Large enough that I'm going to need to hire someone." Odette laughed. "Look at you." "I know." Cleo stopped walking for a moment. "I keep thinking about how it started that one night. Him standing in a hotel lobby talking about me in a language he assumed I didn't speak. He handed you everything." "He did." She started walking again. "He thought he was describing me. He was actually just describing himself, what he could see, which wasn't much." Danton called once in April. She had unblocked his number by then because she no longer needed to. He said he wanted to talk, that things had gotten complicated, that he'd made some mistakes and he'd been thinking. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. A tentativeness, an actual asking. She listened until he finished. "I don't think there's anything useful for either of us in that conversation," she said. "I hope things improve for you, I mean that." She hung up and made tea and went back to the proposal she'd been drafting. On a Saturday in September, 18 months after the night at the Fairmont, Cleo stood at the front of a room at the Vancouver Convention Center. The panel was called Women Shaping Pacific Rim Commerce, and there were about 200 people in the audience. And the woman introducing her was the federal trade minister, which was still slightly surreal. She spoke about languages, about what it meant to be in a room where you understood more than people assumed, about the patience it required and what that patience accumulated into, quietly, over time, without anyone noticing until it mattered. She told a version of the story. Not the personal parts, not the marriage, but the architecture of it. A woman at a dinner table, silent and apparently uninvolved, and the slow, precise decision to convert that silence into something else entirely. People in the audience were very still. Afterwards a young woman came up to her, maybe 25, and said, "That part about patience, I've been thinking about that for months. I didn't know how to say it and you just said it." Cleo looked at her for a moment. "You'll know what to do with it when the time comes," she said. "Most of us do. We just need a reason." She meant it. She had learned it the hard way, in a hotel lobby in Whistler with a champagne glass she'd almost dropped. Listening to her husband explain her in a language he'd assumed she'd never learned. She had converted that into this. Into the conference room in Ottawa, and the business cards, and the apartment with the good light and the work that was genuinely hers. Built from the ground up, brick by careful brick, in the years that followed. She had been underestimated once, precisely once.